Hello, and welcome to the New York State Youth Justice Institute's Lunch and Learn webinar series. My name is Avery Irons, and I'm the Associate for Training and Technical Assistance. On behalf of the YJ, I am happy to welcome each of you to this month's webinar and thank you for joining us during Youth Justice Action Month, a month dedicated to raising awareness about the impact of the youth justice system on youth. Let me also express my thanks to our partners in New York State, the Division of Criminal Justice Services, the Office of Children and Family Services, the University at Albany, and the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. Without their support, we wouldn't be here. Today, we will continue the conversation we started in June and learn more about LGBTQ law and policy in the current legislative climate. It is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Currey Cook. Currey is a senior counsel and youth and out-of-home care project director for Lambda Legal. His bio should be popping into the chat momentarily. Currey, it is wonderful to have you with us today. Thank you for leading us in this very important discussion, and the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. As Avery said, my name is Currey Cook. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm senior counsel and director of the Youth and Out-of-Home Care Project here at Lambda Legal. And we just use kind of that term to capture advocacy on behalf of LGBTQ plus youth and youth living with HIV that are involved in systems that are government funded or placed in out-of-home care, like juvenile justice, child welfare, youth experiencing homelessness. I'm very excited to be here today, and I really appreciate everyone at the Youth Justice Institute for really focusing on LGBTQ plus youth, especially in today's current climate that I know you talked a little bit about in June and heard more about, and we'll talk about what the legal implications look like for all of that today. So let me share my screen and we'll get started. So today we're going to talk a little bit of focusing in on system-involved youth and kind of what that looks like, what we know and don't know about the data around LGBTQ plus youth and their involvement with out-of-home care systems, and also really think about how is it that we make sure that LGBTQ plus youth can actually be safe and thriving in their home, family, and in the community. So much really important discussion happening now around just keeping kids out of systems and how we reduce system involvements because of the vast disparities around what's happening if who ends up in systems because of systemic racism, current racism, oppression based on identity, all the things that we all know contribute to who is involved in these systems, all true for LGBTQ plus youth. And then also once young people are in systems, how is it that we make sure those systems aren't actually perpetuating the harm that young people have experienced in community when they're supposed to be in systems that are designed, at least in theory, to make sure that they thrive and are well and are not involved with the justice system. So we'll get started. So the agenda for today, I'll pop up here just to show you briefly what we're going to do. But first, just to remind everyone, if you're not familiar, that Lambda Legal is, we're just celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. So we are the oldest and largest nonprofit law firm dedicated to advancing equality for LGBTQ folks and everyone living with HIV. We do our work through a mix of public education, like this, what we're doing today, and also impact litigation and policy work to make sure that there are non-discrimination protections in place and that those are enforced. So today I would talk a little bit with you about data and research, as I mentioned a bit about what we know and don't know, then a little about what New York State is doing around prevention, and then a bit about law and policy, both at the federal and New York State level, some thoughts about accountability and what we can do more of, and then really focus on some pathways to progress, like how can New York really be out there as an even more of a leader on this space and making sure that LGBTQ plus youth in the state thrive and aren't system involved. So I'll start this data and research discussion with kind of what we don't know, which is we don't actually know on the national level or state level how many LGBTQ plus youth are system involved in terms of real data, because the vast majority of places are not collecting that data, and I'll talk more about that. What we do have are a lot of great research and studies out there, and a mountain of anecdotal evidence about the overrepresentation of LGBTQ plus youth. A lot of that, as I think you all know from both like your work every day and also more and more information out there about this aspect of system involvement, is rejection by family because of who you are or how you express yourself, who you love. So the interesting thing about the Family Acceptance Project research is really this categorization that you'll see here about whether there are low family rejecting behaviors or high levels, which may seem like a strange concept to get your mind around about how is there low or high rejection. But the high levels of rejection are, I wish you were never born, you're dead to me, I never want to speak to you again, I don't love you anymore. Like, thankfully, these sorts of extreme things are not what the majority of youth experience, but it does happen. And those cause these outcomes that the Family Acceptance Project dedicated. So the takeaway here is, even if we're not magically making home a safe and thriving place for a young person, having the young person and family able to do work that they want to do and can do, and whatever assistance they may need in getting there and reducing the rejecting behaviors, improves outcomes. So always worth doing in every situation, regardless of whether that means a permanency option, home, other things like that. Right? And also, so much of the work around family acceptance by folks who have been adopting the family acceptance model has really shown that this is not about demonizing parents or their beliefs or their values, but it's about helping them understand that some of their rejecting behaviors are often causing the very outcomes that they don't want for their children, because they do love them. So there's some really important work going on, and I'll touch on a bit of that as we go. So you all know that LGBTQ plus youth are overrepresented in a lot of these systems. Probably familiar with the recent New York City study that was done by ACS that showed that 34% of the young people they surveyed who were in foster care in New York identified as LGBTQ plus. A pretty whopping number, a third of the youth in the system. Prior studies had been done in LA, this one in New York. So a federally funded study by Health and Human Services and the Administration of Children and Families was done in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, and also showed 32%. So as we all know, LGBTQ plus youth don't just exist in major cities on the coast. We're everywhere, they're everywhere, but helpful to have a study that shows that yes, in fact, this is true in other places. So here you can tell that I'm a lawyer and not a graphic designer, but this is my sort of crude attempt to kind of demonstrate a little bit about why we have this pipeline into homelessness for LGBTQ plus youth from foster care. Studies that I imagine you have heard about show 40 to 50% of youth experiencing homelessness are LGBTQ plus youth, which is really shocking and appalling. And a really concerning aspect of that is that foster care feeds that pipeline in the vast majority of places. And that's because we really haven't had a robust system to, one, prevent the removal or involvement in foster care, doing those family acceptance services that I mentioned at the very front end, and then we don't have them at every step along the way. So while we're trying to have people with family, with kin, out of congregate care, we haven't really had a robust service array in place to have those services and systems in place. And that means you're kind of sliding down this permanency scale. The end being another planned permanent living arrangement is the APLA one. So as we don't have family acceptance services, and then we don't have a robust array of affirming foster homes, we don't have congregate care facilities, if that absolutely has to be, that are safe, honor a young person's gender identity, have them placed there if that's what they want, all of these things, then you're just sliding down into this lack of permanency and family connection. And those are huge risks for trafficking and homelessness. Also, along the way, we know that not being in an affirming system can really contribute to poor well-being outcomes and disparities. I will note, I'll let you read these stats yourself, but I really want to focus on the one that young people in care, this was from the ACS study in New York City, were told that they behave too much like a person of the other sex. So we really can't divorce what's happening from young people with the misogyny and the stereotypes and all those things are going in. And a lot of this really doesn't actually have much to do with how the person actually identifies, because oftentimes we don't even know that because we're not asking or having a conversation. It's how they're being perceived and how they're expressing themselves in ways that don't fit stereotypes and other things. So really important to think about the young people you're working with and how they express themselves in school and at home and in care and what that may bring upon them. Another study that I really wanted to highlight that is a New York City study done by Dr. Meredith Dank and Mitchell Mora, focused on young people who were engaging in survival sex in New York City. And I want to flag this because this was a study about, again, young people engaging in survival sex, not about experiences with homelessness or about justice system involvement, but you can look at the living situation piece of the young people that were surveyed. The vast majority were experiencing housing instability or homelessness. And then a whopping number of young people had multiple arrests and involvement. This was before New York became a safe harbor state. So out of these arrests, I think in another stat they have from the study, sort of 8th or 9th down the list of the types of offenses young people were being arrested for was prostitution. So what does that mean? It means that law enforcement is having a lot of interaction with young people for things that are happening as a result of their life situation. And that life situation for so many is homelessness. So I kind of feel like this study has gotten a bit lost in the ether in terms of thinking about how it is that we prevent and have young people in situations where they don't need to engage in survival sex and aren't at risk for trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation. So all of this means that we also have way too many pipelines into criminalization. I know you heard a little bit more about that and the risk for that in our current climate in the series presentation earlier this summer. We know a lot about the school to prison pipeline, thankfully. Now, we also have the foster care to prison pipeline. Just being in foster care, regardless of your identity, means you have a higher chance of going into the justice system in some way. Homelessness, of course, as well. Just exposure to law enforcement, quality of life crimes, those sorts of things. And then you have the walking while black, walking while brown, walking while trans, right? All of these things that expose you to heightened police contact and involvement. So the really important thing, I think, to think about here is for LGBTQ plus youth of color, these pipelines are not just operating one over here, one over here, one here. They are often operating simultaneously. If you are a Black trans girl in foster care, you've got all of these things going on that are sort of funneling you in. The homelessness one in particular, because if you, like we used to say when I represented young people in delinquency and foster care cases in Alaska, we would say our clients voted with their feet. If they weren't in an affirming and safe place, a lot of them just decided not to take it and to move. And then we know what risk that puts you at for trafficking, instability, homelessness, and justice involvement. So again, a good example of, I think, the term of intersectionality and how different aspects of your identity can be operating independently or simultaneously to expose you to heightened risk to system involvement. So thinking about prevention, how is it that we disrupt some of these pipelines that we know about and prevent kids from coming into the system? I'm going to show you a slide just a little bit about some good things that are going on and some things ask about. One thing that I think as we talk a bit about SOGI data collection, kind of the underlying why is if we aren't able to have proactive conversations in a safe and affirming way with young people about their identity, we have no idea what's going on in their lives because they're not going to feel comfortable sharing with that. We often don't actually ask young people that we're working with how they identify in terms of their race. We just assume or have a form. We know that there are faith-based providers in the mix here. We know that you've come from a variety of faith traditions, but we don't often ask about religion or sexual orientation or gender identity. And therefore, we don't know. Are you not able to comply with a condition of probation to get your analysis testing because that feels really invasive to you because the gender of the person who's watching you do UA, or because you have to take a bus to a service provider and that bus ride is a harrowing experience where you get harassed because of your gender expression. School, right? So much of our probation requirements are around attending school or a vocational program. But if that place doesn't have a non-discrimination policy or isn't a safe space for you, it's really hard to think about going there and benefiting from the service that we want a young person to, or that they want, but just can't because it's not safe. So the great thing about New York in particular is that we do have non-discrimination requirements in place. It's quite clear in law and policy in all of our systems that you shouldn't be facing discrimination when engaging with these public systems of care. Also, OCFS has in their state policy plan around juvenile justice and child welfare around thinking about prevention and focusing on prevention for this population. The one thing that I'm not sure of is happening, but I hope so, please feel free to message me, if you have good examples of this, is how we're thinking about like engaging young people with lived experience around policy recommendations about prevention. And I think most importantly, thinking about what New York does or doesn't have in place in terms of these family acceptance focused services that I mentioned. Another one I think that we don't often think about being like prevention is community connection. We put out in 2017 a report called Safe Havens with Children's Rights and the Center for the Study of Social Policy, focused on trans and gender expansive youth and out of home care. We're in the process of updating that and it'll be out in January, but as part of that, we have 7 trans, non-binary, and gender diverse youth who have experienced out of home care, who have met with our co-author for this round, who also has lived experience in care and is trans. And I was really struck in listening to their initial interviews that they all mentioned connection to the LGBTQ community and peers as the number one thing system players could do to help them. They didn't necessarily think that the system was going to meet their needs, but they did think the system could get them connected to safe spaces in their community and their peers and their elders, and that was of a huge benefit. So I really struck me as such a concrete takeaway for all of us that are involved, that there are so many things beyond our control, but making that connection and being in a state where we do have a lot of those resources, not enough by any stretch, but a lot more than some, is a real amazing thing to do. The other thing I think, some of you are maybe involved in a lot of these really important conversations about abolition and what that looks like. And if you are, I think great to raise, what does that look like for LGBTQ plus youth who may say be 16 or 17, not have a family member who's accepting, so they don't have anyone to consent to healthcare or school or other things that they need. They may not be picked up by the child welfare system at all because of their age or their circumstance. And sort of where does that leave them when we're talking about a world where we don't have these systems, if we don't have a robust mechanism for kids being supported in their families and their communities? And then I'll talk about data collection as another mechanism for prevention in just a little bit. So I'm not going to dwell long at all about what can be, a little bit like watching paint dry is the old federal law and policy guidance thing. But I do have exciting news to share. There's been a lot of good stuff going on with this current administration. The Administration for Children and Families, part of HHS, as I'm sure you all know, put out a great updated memo on LGBTQ youth, share with Avery and crew a whole resource list that has links to all of these things to share with you all. They have a new LGBTQ senior advisor. Quality Improvement Center that was funded during the Obama years is now its own standalone SOGI center. It has a tremendous amount of resources that are great. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, back in the Obama administration, put out a listening session report. They have now training and technical assistance arm that they funded called the Pride Center. So you can put a request into them to do training, to do technical assistance. They also put out guidance saying that sex as a protected class in the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act includes sexual orientation and gender identity. So now anyone that receives funds through OJJDP or OJP should be complying with federal law and not discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's huge. Also, HUD and RHY, the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act funds that flow through HHS. HUD put out an equal access rule during the Obama administration. There's a lot of great information there. Clear non-discrimination requirements through federal regulation if you're receiving RHY funds, and a lot of information out there on best practices, and I think more to come. So there's just a ton of information out there. All says the same thing that we all know. Don't discriminate against LGBT youth, help them thrive, get connected to resources that they need, but really helpful if you are trying to do this in your own community and need some support. It's all there. So state law and policy. I know you talked a little bit at the last webinar for those who attended about just this sort of wave of anti-LGBTQ law and executive action. This past legislative session in the states in 2023, there were over 500 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced, a record. We also saw states like Texas taking executive action where the governor was directing the commissioner of the Department of Family and Protective Services in Texas to investigate the parents of trans kids who were helping them get connected to qualified medical professionals, following professional standards, and recommending that they get access to gender affirming medical care. That's what they needed. Right? So that is probably unprecedented now, is beginning to lose its meaning, but that definitely was unprecedented to have a state child welfare commissioner doing something so clearly against professional standards, state and federal law and protections, and contrary to the well-being of minors by the very agency charged with their well-being. So it was really alarming. But in addition to that, we have this kind of constellation of other things happening now over, I think, 23 states now that have some version of a ban or limitation on gender affirming medical care, sports bans, limitations on identity documents. We have the Don't Say Gay or Trans bills like in Florida, now Iowa, religious exemptions for 12 states who allow their child welfare, child placing agencies to use religious criteria and turn away people of different faiths and LGBTQ families, bans on accessing facilities consistent with who you are. And then, of course, the book bans that we're hearing so much about and are happening, not necessarily just at the state law level, but also individual school districts in places like New Jersey and California, right? So what's the message to LGBTQ youth, right? Be invisible, be uninformed, be second-class citizens, be marginalized and unwell, and don't be yourself. More, but that's probably a top 5. And I think that's important, even though we're in New York, where we do have great laws and policies in place. We know that this is really impacting young people across the board and their well-being. I think sometimes we also think young people don't pay attention to politics, but that's absolutely not true. In addition to this information from the Trevor Project, we know that when, say, marriage equality passed, calls to Trevor Project's hotline went down. When during the Trump administration, some of the limitations on Title IX were happening, calls went up. This is also inextricably linked to hate crimes and violence. Right? These are not separate things happening, but linked. Like the more we other people as second-class citizens, the more they like become victims of violence and people see them as other and people that can be harmed. So I say all that to say that it's absolutely a time for the LGBTQ youth you're working with to ask how you're doing and have a conversation about this because it's impacting all of us and especially young people. New York, I just wanted to give you a bit of a glimpse as we talk about state law and policy about kind of nationwide. As far as state law and policy protections for youth and juvenile justice systems and youth in the child welfare system, it's a real patchwork. The states in purple, which includes New York, have LGBTQ specific policy and practice guidance. I'll show you what that looks like. But we've really got a long way to go because you can see there are some states in red that have no protected classes of any sort at all in their law and policy. And we'd love for all of these states to be in purple and have some specific guidance. Same for child welfare, right? It's a real mixed bag out there at the state law level. So the sort of purple standard that we had there, which is what we would love to see all states have, is more specific policy and practice guidance, like New York has, and it was one of the leaders in first establishing this. But it's not just don't discriminate on the basis of gender identity. It's like, how does one do that? Place kids consistent with their identity, ensure they get healthcare that you need, you honor their chosen name and pronouns, you ban any type of conversion therapy-esque activity, you make sure that youth are provided education and information about their rights in the grievance process, training to the policy and practice guidance provided, and super important, again, the community connection and family support. So I think there's some real question about like how all of this is being implemented and accountability on whether these requirements are being experienced by youth in real time in their lives and while they're in care, but they are there. So what does New York not have that we could and probably should? No system-specific statutory protections. So we don't have any statutes in New York that are specific to child welfare or juvenile justice that enshrine non-discrimination requirements. We do have an amazing response this session to anti-LGBTQ state laws, like I was mentioning, in Texas and other places. So families can't be extradited or arrested or subject to a court order from another state simply because they're affirming their child and having them connected to medical care. So that was great. We also have a non-discrimination requirement through executive order for contractors, as we all know, a lot of contract providers in this space. That's really good. And then New York does have as leader in the country about SOGI inclusive regulations that cover prevention services, foster care, juvenile justice, youth experiencing homelessness. So that's great. They also have a requirement to promote and maintain a safe environment, to review policies annually. They don't have a lot of specifics, and I'll talk about what that means in a sec. And lots of good policy information. Again, in the resource we'll provide, we have links to all of those who aren't familiar. Also, just recently, OCFS put a great LGBTQ plus community practice model out. We are a state-based system, so a lot of work happening in counties that may not be the same from county to county in the state, but there is an expectation of following this model OCFS put in place. So wanted to shift our last bit here to kind of pathways to progress and just mention some things that are happening in other states and things to think about, because if you're here, I think you share what we would all love to have, which is like to New York to be just a shining star in the country and like support for LGBTQ youth, particularly at this moment. So what are some things we may think about doing? Massachusetts, for example, has an LGBTQ plus youth commission that has done some really important work in like auditing state agencies and what they're doing, thinking about reducing system involvement, involving youth with lived experience, all of those things. Think about that in New York. Having set meetings between advocates, policy providers and policymakers is something that's happening in other states that we've been involved in or helped facilitate. It's been really great having that regular dialogue about what's happening in real time, what more we can do together. I think probably the next one, that a coordinated prevention plan that isn't just siloed into foster care, juvenile justice, or homelessness, but really thinks about this vision of LGBTQ plus youth being safe in homes and community for the state, would just be amazing. Because we really, I don't think, have that vision of how we incorporate all of this important information from the Family Acceptance Project in a way that really is aimed at reducing system involvement. In all of these things I'm talking about, youth engagement is so huge. In the last, I've been at Lambda 10 years, and before that, I'd represented young people in foster care and delinquency cases in Alaska, New Jersey, and here in New York City, where I live now. I have seen just a sea change in the involvement of LGBTQ plus youth that have system experience in change, providing training, being at the policy table. And it is just tremendous, like the changes that have happened because of it. We haven't necessarily had a robust system for compensating young people for their time when the adults are, and also making sure that they're supported in that, because it can be challenging interacting in these kind of bureaucratic spaces where you're not familiar with, right? But where it's worked, it has just been amazing. Statutory non-discrimination protections, as I mentioned, a really robust system of training and technical assistance that I think isn't just here's a resource you can use if you want to, but how do we affirmatively provide training and technical assistance to counties and providers and other folks. Accountability, I'll show you what we have in New York, but that's an important piece. And then data collection, I'll touch on just a second. So for youth engagement, how are they being involved? So maybe sort of an accounting at the moment of where are youth with lived experience involved already? How can that be improved? What strategies can we deploy from places like Foster Club and other folks that have really been doing a lot of thinking about this and really have youth that are involved. A lot of examples on the juvenile justice side as well. With the National Network for Youth, or sorry, National Juvenile Justice Network and National Network for Youth on the homelessness side that have really been engaging in this important work around youth engagement. Statutory improvements, I think we have some examples here. California's Foster Care Bill of Rights, by far the most progressive, has a requirement that young people shall receive gender affirming medical care and shall be placed consistent with identity. That's what they want. So we did not have that in New York, so maybe something to look for. Colorado and Nevada have really important statutory requirements around training and requirements that gender identity be respected in all aspects. New York just recently expanded their human rights ordinance to explicitly cover government entities and government contractors, including school districts. So there's some really good work out there that I think those of us here in New York could kind of look to and think about ways to improve protections on this front. Regulatory, as I said, New York has these great regulations that kind of enshrine non-discrimination protections, but they don't really get into the weeds like some regs in other states that really require dress or grooming, clothing articles be provided consistent with identity, that it just explicitly say you shall not attempt to change or discourage a child's sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression while they're in care. That should go without saying, but we know conversion therapy isn't always just being shipped off to a camp somewhere, right? It can happen in the home, right? Especially when you are placed out of home against your will, someplace that you're not familiar with, and also knowing that if you speak up, that may mean that you are moved to what could be worse or farther away from your school or your friends. So there are so many disincentives to speaking up that we have to be really, really proactive and really, really specific about making sure that this stuff isn't happening, because it's really, I've just heard from so many people I've represented over the years that they know this isn't right, that they know they can say something, but they are deciding to protect themselves and not, and just suffer through the situation that they're in, which I think we can all agree is not acceptable. So accountability. How is it that we hear from young people knowing how hard it is to speak up in the moment at times for really understandable reasons. How are policymakers hearing from CASA volunteers and attorneys for children and other folks on a regular basis who may, because their clients don't feel safe doing it, filing a grievance officially or notifying people because of fear of retaliation? But how do we hear from them what's really going on out there? How are we hearing about just qualitative assessments? Like, have you had a good experience while you've been in care? What was this group home like for you? We are often just moving kids from place to place because there's a bed available and not really asking about what their experience has been. We do have a grievance procedure. There is an office at the ombudsman. I'm not sure how much those folks have had training around LGBTQ youth and what's happening, or how the word's getting out, or if there's a way to gather statistics and protect confidentiality about whether complaints around sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination are a piece of things. But I think this is all worth looking at. Is there a way to make these more robust and get more real-time information about what's happening with young people, and whether all these great things that we have on paper are really matching reality? Because if they're not, it's nice to have them on paper, but what's the point? So on SOCI data collection, I know OCFS has had some really good conversations about this, as I understand, and have, as you'll see here, mentioned in their LGBTQ plus community practice model, the importance of data collection. Some states, like Nevada, pass a data collection bill that requires state agencies to gather sexual orientation, gender identity information. New Mexico's governor did an executive order to that effect. So that's something I know, like probably New York has talked a little bit about legislation on that front. So that may be a possibility to help move things forward. But unless we have numbers in a world that understandably has moved to evidence-based requirements and practices, other things, applying for grant funding, understanding what it is we need to put, say, RFPs out for, to like provide, like all of this without data, it's just really tough. I think advocates, when I first started at Lambda 10 years ago, I think a lot of us are really hesitant to push hard for data collection because we were afraid, like people get harmed. But I think we kind of all, I won't speak for everyone, I'll speak for myself, that like, I think we've moved to a different place of saying like being invisible has not helped anybody. And you could see by what I was capturing in the wave of anti-LGBTQ laws that they're all about keeping people invisible. Like that is a tactic, and that is something that worked, right? We've had years of horrible well-being outcomes in life, partly because being isolated and invisible, right? So that isn't to say we rush into this, right? But New York has some great building blocks to be able to move into safe data collection and doing this. And I think another really important place to engage young people, right? If you had asked me like in the late 80s when I was in high school about my sexual orientation or gender identity, I probably would just like fainted dead away. But like it's 2023. Like that's not the world we're living in now. That's not the conversation young people are having. That's not where we need to go. So I think there's a lot of things that like adults in this space have to kind of think about and reconcile with. And also I've had a lot of clients over the years who are just like, oh my God, these just, if you just asked me, we could end this awkward silence that we're having. So of course, doing that in a good way is really important, but I think we can get there. And I think it's really important in leading to us to collecting this data in a safe and effective way. Also, New York State and all state child welfare agencies are on the cusp of having like a really, or have it now, a really important opportunity, which some of you may have been following the saga around the Adoption, Foster Care, and Analysis and Reporting System rule. In 2016, the Obama administration put out a rule requiring sexual orientation data collection for youth over 14 foster care and for guardians and foster families, which we also don't have information about, their prevalence and involvement in the system. The Trump administration pulled all of those requirements and a bunch of important ones about the Indian Child Welfare Act away. We filed a lawsuit. Unfortunately, we're not successful about it, but this data element remained. which you can see requires state agencies to record whether family conflict related to a child's SOGI was part of what was happening at the time of removal. Not the only reason, not the reason, but one of the reasons. So this begs the question, are investigation workers having conversations, trained or aware to get at whether this is happening? Are they just assuming? Are they having conversations? What are they recording? And if they're seeing this happen, are there referrals being made for family acceptance services? To whom? Do we have those things out there? So I think all of these things are at play because now New York and other states are going to have to be reporting this data either now or very soon. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here for really digging in. So I think that is just the tip of the iceberg of what I'd love to share with you, but that's what we have in terms of our time. Feel free to reach out to me at the email address there, ccook@lambdalegal.org. And I really thank you for inviting me here, and I'll turn it back over to Avery and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Curry. That was wonderful. You were putting in the work, so I appreciate that. So lots of questions. We'll get through what we can. Some questions from me, some questions from the audience, but I'm going to start with the audience because your data collection conversation has got many people raising their hands, mainly looking for resources, supports. So for agencies, I'll kind of combine a few questions into one, but for agencies that are looking to update their policies or develop policies at intake and all along the way, are there, among those resources you're leaving with us, anything that will be helpful for them or anything that you can point us to?
Yeah, as I mentioned on the juvenile justice front, but as I understand it, they're not just limiting it to juvenile justice. If you know folks working in that world, there is the Pride Center, and we have in the resources that we'll share with you a link to the request for training and technical assistance there. So that is being managed by the National Council for Juvenile and Family Court Judges, but they are partnering with the SOGI Center that I mentioned, which is now out of the University of Connecticut. They have, in the link that's in the PowerPoint, they have a lot of a whole page on data collection, videos. They work with pilot projects both in Cuyahoga County and in Detroit on that. So there's great information there. I'll also put a link in the chat for Serious Policy Research. They're amazing. Angela Irvine, who heads that up, has done a lot of work, I think, with some New York counties around probation, child welfare data collection. So there are a lot of great resources out there. You definitely don't have to reinvent the wheel. Lots of information about like demographic forms and how to make those LGBTQ plus inclusive. So so definitely utilize those resources. You don't have to start from scratch by any means.
Awesome, thank you. So you're sending a lot of folks to Angela Weeks and Angela Irvine.
Yes.
Handle the work. So we can highlight that as we send out the resources you've left with us for folks, but thank you. So next question is, I want to spend just a moment talking about sanctuary states or safe haven, localities that have been developing or emerging across the country. They're just like, what are the impacts? Are we able to say that we're starting to see national impacts of the supports that these jurisdictions are creating?
I think that's tough to say just yet about what we're seeing. I mean, I think you can't underestimate the importance of those conversations and passing those laws to trans and gender diverse youth and their families and the LGBTQ plus community writ large, of just knowing that that's the case and this is a safe space. I mean, we certainly know that a lot of families have left places like Texas. I mean, those that were able to do so, unfortunately, for reasons of like economics or family ties, work, like a lot of families can't leave. So, but I think there are probably some questions that are going to tease out. We're going to tease out later about like court's jurisdiction and what happens when you're in a really contentious custody case in one of the states that's passed a gender affirming care ban, for example, and a place that has a safe haven law. and what happens there. So I sure there's going to be litigation about some of that stuff when it happens, but at least families know that, if they are able to relocate where they can, that has some of these important protections on the books. I think it's a little early to tell how they're going to pan out.
Yeah. Yeah. And so kind of along that line, I'm going to combine a couple questions. So one, I guess the overarching thing is, what are the strategies that, we asked Dr. Panfield this in June, kind of more from the social service perspective and research perspective, but what are the strategies that are being used in the states where families are remaining to provide supports? Or ask you from the legal perspective, are there strategies emerging in those states, or things that, allies who are not lawyers can be doing to kind of buttress those efforts?
Yeah, it's so much there. I think we saw organizations like Tent, Transgender Education Network of Texas, and Equality Texas, TILDEP, others really kind of jump in and provide like safety folder toolkits for families. And like, if you, in our lawsuit challenging DFPS's directive, for example, like PFLAG is our lead plaintiff, and so if you join PFLAG, you're protected under a temporary injunction that's in place from being investigated. So it was, here's a fund to allow you to join PFLAG if that's not within your budget right at the moment, or you hadn't been planning that. So I think there's really practical things like that. We're also doing an analysis of whether some of the gender affirming care bans, like they focus on, in the majority of states, on the provider not providing the care, not on the individual getting the care. So like we're seeing in the abortion context, can you just get that over state lines and come back and, still be safe and not penalized or criminalized for doing that, like providing that guidance and information to people. I know there have been, relocation funds. The other thing that I'll say that I think really, like, the country as a whole and like allies, the corporate community, other folks really need to think about the resources for LGBTQ plus youth themselves in states. New York City is a very need more of a resource rich area, but we know, like, say, a Rainbow Center in El Paso, Texas, or Jasmine in Jacksonville, Florida, as my grandma used to say, like, are rubbing two nickels together, right, to get their funding. And we have a lot of corporate support, say, for like the Trevor Project, which is fantastic. They should be. But what does that mean if you are in a small to mid-sized city in the US that doesn't have a lot of corporate headquarters, or doesn't have somebody, a development department, right, bringing resources there? And what does that mean for young people who can't relocate out of states that are so impacted and need mental health, and well-being support? That could also lead to making sure they don't go further into the system or get system involved. So I think that's a really important conversation that we should all be having as we're engaging with funders and the corporate communities. How do we support youth in that way?
Definitely, no, that's excellent. And I know there's lots of conversations around things like direct cash transfers and all those things. So
Yes, absolutely.
yeah, interesting to hear more about those strategies. Speaking of young people, you mentioned in one of your slides, you were talking about youth engagement strategies and model youth engagement strategies. And so curious if you could say a little bit more about anything that you've seen around the country that's been particularly innovative or particularly effective. You mentioned the Foster Club and things happening through National Juvenile Justice Network, just models that you can point folks to that we can learn more about.
Yeah, I'll definitely put in the chat. I mean, the amazing young adults that we get to work with a lot. Elliot Hinkle, who's a non-binary adult who lives in Portland, who had experience with Wyoming's foster care system. And I think they're like a great example of like what support and engagement leads to. They have their own like consulting and technical assistance business now. So are actually like going to places like Georgia and talking to them about how their youth engagement work can be LGBTQ plus inclusive. And like Foster Club has had a whole separate like group of alums who are LGBTQ informing their policy position statements that they take, and making sure that when they are, say, going to Congress to lobby for something, that like it's always LGBTQ plus inclusive, even if the particular member they're talking to isn't. So there's some of those things. We've also seen places like, we work a lot with Children's Action Alliance Arizona, and they have a youth advisory council that works with them. And they have made a point of that being a safe space, as has Florida Youth Shine. And so you can see, as those entities have done the work, they then have members who are bringing LGBTQ plus issues to the forefront. So I think a lot of it is thinking about how some of these infrastructures that we've had in place to support people with lived experience as they engage in policy work and training, if they haven't been inclusive historically, how do they get them there? Because they have the general infrastructure helped. It just needs to be more inclusive in a lot of places. And then I think there's the other thing that you see across the country is a lot of the youth advisory councils that exist, whether they're juvenile justice, youth experiencing homeless, other, are under the umbrella of a state agency. And that can be really helpful in informing the state agency and making their work inclusive, not as effective around holding the agency accountable if you're under the agency's oversight. So we're seeing places like Facing Foster Care in Alaska, for example, that is an independent organization that has a lot of Alaskan Native queer youth. Really, like, they were a plaintiff in our lawsuit against the Trump administration of taking out SOGI protections in the HHS grants rule. So I think that independent voice is really important in making sure it's queer inclusive.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to push us back to data for a minute. You started it 10, 15 years ago. We couldn't get anybody to talk about data because this is a nice change of speed. So a couple of things I will just try to combine together. So there's the discomfort that practitioners had. And you started to talk about this, about adults being uncomfortable, but this question is about people who are concerned about parent caregiver reactions. And then I would just add on to that. Actually, let's leave that one there. We'll leave that one there. Just especially in the current climate, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just it's something we've been giving a lot of thought about, and I personally have around kind of these forced outing provisions and other things. And I think universally, I think we could imagine as like a parent or a caregiver or somebody, like, of course, like, you kind of don't want to be the last person to know about what's going on with your own child. So I think like a lot of that is sort of understandable, but I think there's such a gulf between like that reality and what's really happening. I mean, we know, look at the foster care statistics, like something's going on, right? Like everyone is not met with rainbows and unicorns when they come out. And a lot of these things really are just one extreme to the other. Like, you say something, you're out. Like, where is the let's help you have this conversation? Whereas let's get the services you need. Whereas let's make sure you're safe in that. And so, of course, in the child welfare system, juvenile justice, right, we're dealing with that kind of in the extreme when you are no longer at home, maybe because you're in a detention center or foster care, parental rights are in flux in some way or may not be there. I think the answer for like folks working in those systems is we have a different set of obligations as a professional working in those systems, and always your work should be centered in social science and professional standards and well-being. And that leaves you in a place of being focused on the young person and what's there for them, and having a conversation with them about that. And of course, as a part of that is always, who else knows? Who have you talked to about this? What would it mean if we share? If you're ready to share, how do we do that in a way? And sometimes that may mean getting flack from parents who aren't happy about the fact that you've had this conversation. I got fired by a parent representing a 9-year-old who parent had the 9-year-old fire me in Bronx Family Court because I said, in response to some questions, it's okay to be whoever you are, couldn't have been more innocuous, but got me fired. Right. So, I mean, it can happen. I think it's more about how we prepare ourselves for those conversations and have a policy and guidance for people about how we can have them in the best possible way, reminding of like who we're here for, and why we're having them.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry you got fired by a client. Um,
Yeah.
last question from the audience. And just kind of tagging onto that a little bit, like if this information comes out for a parent, I just want you to say a little bit about kind of family acceptance project. There's a question about kind of mediation and assisting youth and parents reconcile differences and communicate to these things. So for folks who may not be aware of what the family acceptance project does,
Yeah.
can you offer a little bit about that model?
Sure. So there have been sort of other folks like around the country who have taken Dr. Caitlin Ryden's kind of model and idea and employed with her guidance and assistance those practices or kind of develop their own iteration. And then like the Ackerman Institute here in New York City does a lot of that work and is a great resource. But basically the idea is that you are centering kind of the common ground, as I mentioned before. Like the reality is LGBTQ folks have a lot of like bad outcomes, right? Because of discrimination, also a lot of like parents' rejection is like, I don't want that to happen to you. I don't want you to have those outcomes, be part of that. So not realizing that like it's becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy if you're having these rejecting behaviors. So it is kind of more about this isn't about you or your belief, but about the impact that you're having. And, is there a middle ground? So is it like, okay, I need a minute with this whole queer thing, but I still love you. Like that's an improvement over get out of my house. I never want to see you again. Right. And so it's kind of moving back and providing information. And I worry now that because identity has been intentionally politicized by so many folks now that there may be folks who just, they don't know that they've had LGBTQ family members. They don't really know someone who's trans, for example, and they like need a minute, but now they're receiving these messages that are just baked in disinformation and lies and building on all these ridiculous stereotypes about queer people. So they're hearing that from people that they look to for information. So I think it's a lot about just, facts and information and just kind of centering folks and like, well, don't you want your child to be happy? Regardless of whether you agree with this or not, do you want them to be healthy and well and, employed and not, all those things. It's kind of more about centering that. But a lot of the programs who have deployed like this model are extraordinarily successful. There are certainly families that don't get there, but the vast majority do. And I think that's important for us to like take and embrace.
Well, thank you, Curry. I appreciate that. I want to thank you on behalf of the YJI and everyone who attended today for taking the time to share this incredibly important information with us. But before I start the housekeeping and closing us down, I just want to see if you have any last kind of closing thoughts for the audience.
Oh, yeah, I guess, in thinking about sort of the pathways to progress piece of it, I think I did have one poll question to see, like, for those of you who attended, if, there's sort of an interest in thinking about like how we move forward with like a work group or plan or, thinking about how we make some of these possible improvements happen. So
the poll is on the screen now, and I'll say that if you are interested, if you're one of the people checking yes, we're sending out a survey at the end of this, right after this webinar ends. And there is a question there asking for your name and contact information, and the YJI will forward that on to Curry and the good folks at Lambda Legal to be in touch with you. So please do respond to that survey.
great. I see a lot of folks interested, so that's amazing. Thank you.
This is how you get more work, Curry, which is good.
There you go.
So thank you so much, Grace. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you to pull this webinar together. So as I close us up for the day, I want to just say that in addition to that survey, we are also going to right now ask you, send you a survey or put a survey on the screen asking you about the effectiveness of this particular webinar. So please let us know and respond to this closing poll. In terms of housekeeping for the webinar series, while everyone is answering that question, the next YJI Lunch and Learn webinar session will be held on October 24th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time with Dr. Jocelyn Meza, a professor and licensed clinical psychologist at University of California at Los Angeles. Her presentation is titled Risk and Protective Factors Associated with Mental Health Questions Among Youth of Color, Leveraging Telehealth Interventions to Address Mental Health Needs. There is a link that is going into the chat right now, so please sign up and join us for that event next month. Finally, if you've not already done so, feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. The links to those accounts can be found on our website. And just a reminder that the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. In closing, I want to thank you all for taking part in this session of the YJI Lunch and Learn series. We hope that you've gained something from this webinar and that you will continue to think about what Currey has shared with us today. We look forward to seeing you at future YJI events. Thank you and have a good day.